It was only last week that President Bush could be heard in the tone of voice that might be the verbal equivalent of wagging the finger. No president wants war, he said. Tonight, more evidence to suggest, at least in his case, that might not have been true. A secret pre-war memo documenting an Oval Office meeting between Mr. Bush and his British counterpart, Tony Blair, long on the political table in England, now verified here. It reveals the two were determined to go to war 6 weeks before invading Iraq. Mr. Bush, certain that war was, quote, inevitable. Mr. Blair's chief foreign policy advisor at the time, writing in the memo, quote, our diplomatic strategy had to be arranged around the military planning. The start date for the military campaign was now penciled in for 10 March. Never mind that then Secretary of State Colin Powell had yet to address the United Nations for a second resolution condemning Iraq, one that, of course, the administration failed to secure. Let's call in Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell, who has been following the story from Washington. Andrea, good evening.
Good evening to you, Keith.
The president's critics were saying then that the war was a fait accompli, the UN presentation, all the diplomacy virtually a sham. Did this document to any degree confirm that timeline and that criticism?
Well, it certainly confirms that timeline. Now, we should point out that there was a previous memo, also British, the so-called Downing Street memo, which reflected the reporting of another British official back the previous summer, which said to the British officials that after a visit to Washington, that it was very clear that George Bush was set on going to war. So there had been earlier reporting in the last year or so that there were war decisions being made 6 months in advance. This clearly, though, does indicate that at that meeting in the White House with Tony Blair, January 31st, 2003, 5 days before Colin Powell was going to the United Nations, that this was really a military planning session, and that whether or not they found weapons of mass destruction, whether or not Saddam Hussein turned anything over, whether or not there was further action by the UN, none of that was going to matter.
Indeed, if there was an alternative to allied military action, to use that old familiar term, the memo suggests that Mr. Bush, at least, might have been looking for ways to provoke Saddam Hussein into starting the shooting. Is that correct?
Well, one of the most provocative things, and that's the right word to use, I think, for this, in that memo is David Manning, the now British ambassador, formerly National Security Advisor to Tony Blair, present at the meeting, saying that at one point President Bush suggested painting a reconnaissance plane, a spy plane, an American U-2, in UN colors, hoping to provoke Saddam Hussein to fire at it so that then they could justify invading.